Good morning. My name is Asa Cobb.
I'm Eli Thomas.
I'm Preston Violet.
I'm Ryan Worley.
And I'm Andrew Renniger, and we would like to present our senior group performance.
The Long and Winding Road.
How the Beatles pioneered new technology.
In combining classical and popular music.
Creating a new musical mainstream. Classical music has been a staple of human culture for centuries, and for good reason.
The power of music has been widely recognized in the field of social theory.
From Plato to Adorno.
As having an influence over character, social construct, and action.
It connects humanity through time.
And adds emotional value to the human experience.
Western classical music is easily recognizable because its tune is constructed of a series of notes which belong to a group of notes called keys.
These are arranged into familiar patterns which work well together.
For centuries, composers used these familiar and successful patterns.
Until the 20th century, when composers deliberately dismantled the old note system. Bold move.
For the first time in history, a division developed between music lovers and music.
In the 1950s and 60s, classical composers decided to abandon not just the note system, but every other recognizable feature of Western music.
And music lovers just weren't getting the new sounds.
Any noise, from rubbing sandpaper to bouncing a tennis ball, was considered music.
Very avant-garde.
Classical music, as a living and communicative language, had ground to a halt.
In post-imperial Britain,
The country experienced a transfer in national energies from military and political
To socioeconomic and cultural, but not without strife.
In 1962, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson claimed,
the British have lost an empire and not found a role.
The winds of change were blowing throughout the world.
And after the relinquishment of the British colonies,
The empire which saw no sunset was finished.
in this state of political and social shift in 1960s England, many changes were occurring.
Youth began to abandon the social norms established by their parents to express themselves politically, socially,
And as consumers.
It was this extraordinary economic development that paved the way for everything that followed.
Changes in fashion, an examination of gender roles, and a shift away from austerity.
And in music. There were definitely changes in music.
In the 20th century, classical music and popular music collided to create a new musical mainstream.
And the chief architects of this new style were the Beatles.
They reinvigorated the old traditional patterns and pioneered new technology with enthusiasm and imagination.
They changed the sound, the ambition, and the language of popular music.
All right, class, let's get started. Good morning, Eli. I'm looking forward to all of your presentations on Western classical music, which we are defining as music created and composed in Europe, the United States, and societies shaped by European immigrants. Preston, you're up first.
Yes, sir. Now, before I begin, I just want to warn you, this is probably going to be the best presentation you've ever seen.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, seriously, it's extraordinary.
Thank you.
31 sources,
Thank you.
all primary. Western classical music dates back to the medieval era. This religious music was called plain chant, a single-line melody sung in Latin, the language of the church. The most famous was Gregorian.
All right, thank you. I think we get the picture. Thank you, Preston and friends. Ryan, you're up next.
Next up would be the Renaissance. When it came to making music more accessible, nothing compared to the fabulous new printing press. Musical artists such as Bird, Tallis, and Des Prez composed their sounds into the heads of the masses, sprouting a variety of new ideas.
Very well done. Eli, you're up next.
Well, I can relate to this next era, Baroque, which I am. The Baroque era was obsessed with decoration, and music was no exception. It became more complex and difficult to perform, as shown through the composers like Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi.
Very well done. Now to the classical era.
composers created rules for music that included balanced structures, clear organization, and simple melodies. The symphony was created. And composers and musicians began to think of themselves as artists.
And finally, the Romantic era. Composers like Chopin, Brahms, Verdi, Debussy expressed their desires through their compositions. Now, these are often the composers we think of most. But what if I told you there was another set that we don't think of? The Beatles.
The Beatles?
Yes, the Beatles. By the time the Beatles arrived on the scene in 1962, practically the only new music anyone wanted to listen to was popular music.
Reliant on cleverly crafted phrases set to a frenetic rhythm.
Guaranteed to appeal to a teen audience.
In 1956, Chuck Berry released Roll Over Beethoven. The meaning was clear. Rock and roll was overtaking the old established order.
Symbolized by the classical composers. And while pop music was catchy, it was limited and recycled the same few chords, song structures, and rhythm.
The Beatles rescued the classic patterns discarded by the modernists and put them to use in pop music. Now, this begs the question, can music be popular and meaningful? To continue our conversation, we have 4 guests. Please welcome Stephen Rogers, music producer and artist, Randy North, recording artist, Dr. Howard Schultz, music theorist, and finally Brett Griffin, music promoter. Thank you all for being here. Stephen, let's get started with you. Please tell us about the musical impact left by the Beatles on us today.
Yes, well, prior to the Beatles, most artists were getting their songs from exterior sources. But the Beatles, they changed the entire paradigm when they began writing their own music. This creatively changed the whole music industry and raised the standards for all musicians.
And soon, if you want to write your own stuff, you would not be recognized anymore.
And it wasn't that they were just writing their own music, it was how none of the Beatles were musically trained. They were all self-taught.
Just like myself.
Well, I know a few of them went to art school, which I know is for students that couldn't make it to traditional university.
But I went to art school.
Ah.
But it's important to remember that classical music was being cast aside by an avant-garde movement at the time. However, the Beatles, without training, were intuitively incorporating the very elements that made Western classical music great.
Well, the Beatles were ahead of their time in absorbing musical influence.
Randy, what do you mean by that?
Well, the Beatles borrowed from here, there, and everywhere.
I believe that the Beatles' inventiveness proved to the composers of the time that you could take the basic elements of Western classical music and create something new and powerful.
And that is Eleanor Rigby.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in a church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream, waits at the window, wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by the door. Who is it for?
It is both beautiful and sinister.
No other song at the time quite expresses how dramatically the style as composers was developing.
Why is it different from everything else in 1966? It's modal, a technique which dates back to ancient Greece. Eleanor Rigby is an urban version of a tragic English folk ballad in the Dorian mode.
But by the time the Beatles wrote Eleanor Rigby, they had already made history by using a string quartet to back up McCartney in Yesterday. I mean, no one was making music like that in the 60s.
When recording Eleanor Rigby, they closely mimicked the instruments.
4 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos.
No one had ever done that before.
The musicians were horrified.
What emerged was a classic that far exceeded the usual limitations of rock and roll.
Now, why did they have the courage to do that?
Well, the idea of casting off musical norms appealed to the Beatles. They had a driving interest in concocting new sounds.
Like Penny Lane, which featured multiple mid-song key changes, also known as modulation.
A technique specific to Western classical music.
In this cheerful tune, McCartney changes key 7 times.
Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. There beneath that blue suburban skies, I sit and meanwhile back.
This new sound exploded their demographic to include both children and older adults, which marked a leap in popularity unmatched in the history of art.
Now, did that reinvigorate interest in classical music?
The Beatles led the marriage of high to low culture in the 1960s, making it a key piece of their accomplishment, pleasing classical audiences and pop listeners alike.
And no one expected anything serious to come out of the working class or the north of England. Important things were supposed to be done by upper-class grown men in London.
Finally, one thought from each of you to sum it up.
Pioneers in the studio.
Best band of the 20th century.
Artists.
Defined modern songwriting.
Will we still be talking about them in 50 years?
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Western classical music expresses the deepest thoughts of our civilization. Through their music, composers paint a picture of the times and society in which they live.
As genuine musical innovators, the Beatles pioneered the frontiers of popular music by using old notes with new technology.
Our musicians, young and old, now live and work in a new musical mainstream that the Beatles helped to create.
It's through the Beatles and their passionate belief in it that we owe the dramatic comeback of the Western musical system.
Even now, there are those who say that music is of mass appeal and cannot also be music of great significance or depth.
There are very few composers in history whose work has changed everything that has followed it.
Four cheeky youth from Liverpool, open to the world and all its promise.
Offered something very different to the music of their generation.
Transformed how music was composed.
Produced,
Experienced and enjoyed,
Creating a new status quo in the music industry that is still emulated to this day.
frontiers are crossed and history changed.
when bold pioneers embrace existing elements
and fuse them into a new combination.
Forming a unique work of art
that is greater than the sum of its parts.